Are tabletop war games all just statistics and dice rolling? Or are there lessons that we can learn from actual military engagements that we can then apply to our tabletop games to make us have greater success? Today, me and my guests are going to discuss that and learn a little bit more about the history of war. My name is Tanya, otherwise known as the War Mistress. I've painted some minis, I've played some games, and I'm on a mission to be nice and roll dice. Hey everybody, we are finally back with another episode of Be Nice, Roll Dice, and I'm your host Tanya. And today we're going to be talking about military lessons that we might be able to use to make us better war gamers. And my guest today is Red Powell. He is my, I guess you could say, I guess we're both co-hosts of Forge the Narrative podcast. I'd say that you're the sassy one, but
I'm the sassy one. I feel like Adam's the sassy one. I get provoked.
I feel like Adam's the Australian one, but I think you get the sassy one. Yeah.
No, fine.
But for people who don't know who you are, Red, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
My name is Red Powell. I am again co-host along with Tanya and Paul and Adam on Forge the Narrative, and I am the U.S. Army Esports team, 40K team. I'm the team captain or team manager, they might call it. Um, I'm also a proliferate wargamer that plays a wide range, but I do find myself spending most of my hobby time now currently in 40K, mainly for the last few years. But yeah, that's a down and dirty, rough introduction.
All right. And I did actually notice, maybe it was yesterday, that the U.S. Army Esports team is doing pretty good in the ITC rankings right now.
Yeah, we've actually done pretty well historically. We've got some good representation. It's still way early in the season, so we won't claim anything big up front, but we did finish, I think, in the ITC season last year. If I'm not mistaken, it was 15th place overall. And we had one of our players was top demons, like #1 demons in all of ITC. We've got some. But it's not just about being competitive. I mean, we do
Right.
like to show up, but if you don't mind, I'll kind of segue into that. Like the U.S. Army Esports team, I've been really proud to be a member of it and to be able to have led it as the team captain and manager for the last couple years. Again, it's not just about being competitive, it's about being part of the community and just being a good player at the very core of it. And those are the three things, right? Being able to play and play well, not necessarily. Not everybody is competitive. We're much more interested in having players at all levels of the tables, um, and we're much more interested in building and fostering a community, and we're definitely interested in making sure that we have the best engagements with people at an individual level. And so those are our major three focus areas. And again, it's we we do all right. It's we're not topping any charts, but we've got some pretty good players out there that do well by us and the team. So.
Mhm. Mhm. And you guys have sick jerseys. Just gonna say that. You got
Thank you.
like your jersey game is on point. I looked at the
Thanks.
last ones and I was like, ah, I kind of want one. Like they are
There's
sick.
nothing stopping you from getting one either. You're
All
more
right.
than welcome to grab one.
All right. Well, I might have to just because they are so amazing. But diving into the topic, the first question that I wanted to start with is I have noticed that a lot of people use the term strategy and tactics interchangeably when they are referring to war games. And as far as I know, I'm no expert, those terms are not the same. So I thought maybe you could walk us through each one and what they mean, and then we could talk about whether or not Warhammer is a strategy game, a tactics game, or both.
Absolutely. And so it's a common thing that those terms are used interchangeably, and that's I totally understand because in most cases they're not being used in maybe the professional context in which they have been meant for in certain areas. And so for a lot of people, they are interchangeable, and that's okay. I'm never gonna, stop a conversation and be like, well, actually,
Yeah,
I'm not
because we
gonna
know
do
what
that.
you're saying. Like, we know what you're trying to get down there. Yeah.
Right, right, right. Yeah, you know where it's going. And so with that, it is actually there's a pretty important distinction. And when it comes down to it in my professional aspect and my studies that I've done over time, I mean, I guess, covering that with the Army, having been in for 16 years, almost 17 years now, um, the vernacular is important. There is a distinction between it and what it actually means. And so when it comes down to it, uh, it's funny because you'll see some folks they echelon it, right? There's grand strategy, there's strategy up here, and then some people, some schools of thought will go to operations. So there's actually an invisible word in there in some thoughts called operational, and I'll actually use that and tie that into our wargaming here. And then there's tactical, and so they'll put it in three circles of strategy, operational, and tactical. And so what that would infer is that tactical being the very lowest level, the that's where the action occurs, strategy being more about the intent kind of approach. And then what some will say is operational links those individual actions with that intent, and that's where you get operational aspects. So when you talk about tactics, in a lot of cases, tactics is ground maneuvering, or even there's air tactics, and it's an aspect of what's happening in an individual action and those things that might come together in that action. Whereas strategy is usually used in terms of much broader concepts. And so when you come down to tactics, it's, how can you immediately act upon something, and how can you do this to cause this to immediately lead to this, all right there in that moment. Whereas strategy is there's a whole aspect of ends, ways, means, and here's what I want to accomplish over a grand scale, and here's what I have available to do it, and here's how I'm going to do it with those things, right? So ends, ways, and means. And so that's kind of the breakup there. Strategy is this massive thing. It's supposed to be this high level thing. A lot of times where you see where people conflate the two, in professional terms, you see actually a lot of bad friction occurring because strategic is supposed to be this level that goes up here. That's supposed to be so far above the ground level, and a lot of times, we talk about seeing the forest for the trees kind of deal. If you find yourself analyzing one tree, it's kind of hard to see everything else all by itself. And so, being too tactical can lead to bad strategy at sometimes. And there's benefits to having that separation. So, what I would argue in some cases, though, is that instead of it being as I depicted it initially of a hierarchy of strategy and then tactics, it's really more of it's linear in a certain way. And so by turning it on its head, you've got to be able to understand what's happening, right? There's a lot of whys and what's going on. And so taking it to this next level with wargaming and how we look at it is saying something like, I mean, and I've done this because, and I'll use Adam as an example as well. His recent goal to become number one Dark Angels player, right?
Hmm.
I've there's been 2 years, in fact, where I've come out and said, well, first year I wanted to be the number one Necrons player, and this next year I wanted to be the number one Corn player. That's a goal. That is an end state, right? That's strategically I decided that is the goal that I want, and Adam has done the same thing. And so when it comes down to it, you have to figure out, well, what do I have in front of me, and how am I going to accomplish it? Well, I've got a Necron army. He's got a Dark Angel army. Like, okay, we have the means.
Hmm.
the next part is there's probably some acquisition that has to occur. I've got to increase my means. I've got to get whatever range of army, and then my ways in which I accomplish it is, well, I'm going to go to these games. I've got to do this well at these matches, at these bigger events, and I've got to make these points in order to actually accomplish that goal, right? So
Hmm.
that's strategic. That's the strategy. When you get into a great way, especially with Warhammer 40K, to look at it is the games are tactical elements. They are tactical engagements. There might be some strategic thought that goes into it and how you go into list building and how you approach the meta, how you approach an event, right? Because you're thinking long term. You're thinking, I'm going to fight these opponents. I'm not just going to be stuck in this one environment. The game itself is a tactical execution. And so that's where this delineation comes down to it, is that while there were some strategic elements that might have fed into the game that you play in a one-off instance, that one-off instance is absolutely tactical. And when you think about it, and I know you've heard me rant about some of my game mechanics, right? I mean, and not to break my nose off on this one, but I mean, I with a master's in war game design, game mechanics, I love analyzing game mechanics. And when it comes down to it, there is a wholly comprehensive tactical aspect to Warhammer and how we move, how the whole turn is constructed. You move, you shoot, you fight, you go through the actions. Notice with Necrons and Corn, I didn't include the psychic phase in that breakdown. But so right. Um, but yeah, so that's again that's the breakdown
Hmm.
is how you approach that. And so that's the tactical break. And then when I get into the operational aspect, so you take these events, you say, I'm going to go to this event, I'm going to go to this event, I'm going to go to this event. The operational aspect would be linking all of those events together to achieve what your strategic goal is, right? And so when you go into an event and you understand, well, I mean, and we've seen players do it to certain extents. We've seen them approach events in certain ways. I think some of the pro players or very competitive players out there definitely go into it with an analytical review of how the event is going to break down. If I play this well at this rate, under this circumstances of how the event is set up, I'm going to play against these people at this period of the game, right?
Hmm.
And there's an operational aspect to that. That's that there's it it's almost like every event is its own kind of campaign to its own extent. You've got, say it's a 5 round event, you have 5 battles, 5 tactical events that you now have to link together in order to win that event, to do as well as you can, to get the points that ultimately feed into your strategy. So I, I think I've painted hopefully a relatable scenario here between tactical, operational, and strategic here.
So, would the list building phase be considered the strategy in Warhammer?
I think it is strategic, especially
Yeah.
with the way that you approach events. There's so much to the again looking at strategy with ends, ways, means in regards to means, how you're setting yourself up with what you have available. That's the thing about um, 40K is that in the real world circumstances you don't necessarily have points, you have money. And
Hmm.
when you look at it and you look at a country that puts you know $800 billion into it versus a country that has fractions of that, I
I was
mean
gonna
the
say Canada probably puts like $5 and a stick of gum into it, so.
but I mean it goes back into, so you have your means, and that's exactly it. And so imagine if every game was, well, I show up with 6,000 points and you have 2,000 points. Like the nice thing about 40K is it confines everybody into a certain degree. It doesn't matter who has the most money to certain extents. I mean, it does because ultimately the meta, right? Yeah, there's an
Yeah.
aspect to that. There is an aspect to that. But uh, when you get to the table, though, everybody has 2,000 points. And
Hmm.
the game mechanics will tell you just by looking at them that not every army is equal or necessarily point cost relatively the same. And so there's some difference to that, but it's still a structure that tries to impose the means and how we get into it. And so list building is a perfect way to strategically look at what you're going to have to deal with over the long term. And that's where I think when we talk about meta and how the meta affects list building and how you go into certain events, understanding what meta you're going to be playing against, that's an operational view. You're taking strategically what you have available, applying an operational view to how you're going to execute those tactics against what you're going to come up against, right? I mean, we look at it, if you look at, if I was going to put it in more modern military terms, if I was going to play against someone who was just going to line up in a field wearing red uniforms in the middle of a green field and they were all going to have muskets, and I showed up to the fight with automatic assault rifles and grenades. Yeah, I mean there's going to be clear different distinct advantages to that, right? And
Mhm.
so it's just understanding what you're going up against and how you're going to play into that.
Okay. So, is there any value, and I'm really interested in this because I am not like a history buff. I'm not like a military buff or anything like that. But I am curious if there's any value in studying past military engagements to find things, tactics, or anything like that that can help me become a better wargamer.
Absolutely. And so three things that I would say that go well into the study of, because really for Warhammer, it's nice because it's confined in a certain regard that you can understand cause and effect a lot easier, right? There's only so much of this random element that we often see throughout history that seems to like spark and take over. You can, if you understand the rules, there's only so much that a person can get away with in 40K in comparison to real life where there's thresholds that humans are willing to quote unquote break rules in order to accomplish objectives. And so there's differences to that. But so yes, absolutely, three things that I think that apply very well to the study of tactics, operations, and strategy: history, theory, and doctrine. And so that's a very professional grouping right there. But when we turn it into war games and we take history, theory, and doctrine, theory is a lot of what we might, in some regards, call math hammer. In other regards, it's just us talking about how we're going about it, right? Doctrine is some of those things that have essentially become, whether it's between game mechanics and understanding the different game mechanics and how they play into it, and then looking at what is habit amongst the groups or the meta, right? And so then the next part being history. So when we look at history, some of these examples of how things occur and how things play out, there are some really good examples historically in how we can do things. And it does take some of those, you have to have tactical aspects of it, right? You have to understand where you're going with it. Um, and so, just one example, and this one isn't so much in the tactical aspect as much as it is in the game aspect of it. And by game, I mean like between you and another person, right? So Caesar Augustus versus Pompey Magnus, right? This is near the end of their campaign, and just I'm pulling this historical example out, so bear with me. That Caesar is outmanned. He's been essentially put on the back foot this whole campaign. Pompey Magnus is has way more people in this case. I mean, just absolutely, it is the 6,000 versus the 2,000 point army fight. Um, and all Pompey has to do is just close it down, and he will crush Caesar, and Caesar will be merely an upstart that was ruined by the Republic of Rome. However, Caesar rallies his people, his soldiers, and he's able to make himself on the battlefield seem more, and he finds a point of penetration, and it essentially cripples Pompey Magnus's ability to execute, and the army falls apart. 6,000 points out the window as 2,000 points just steamroll it through a matter of morale. And so, in a lot of cases, what I would say in some games where I know many people have played it, sometimes the other person gets in the head of the other person. It just happens. It's an element of human nature. And with that, where the first player in this case clearly had the winning set and everything was going in their favor, because the other person gets in their head, their game immediately crumples, right? And so that's a little bit more esoteric in certain regards, but it absolutely applies because there are fewer cases than warfare, unfortunately, where we see human nature play out so blatantly. And our war games are not just us against computers or NPCs or what have you. They are against other people, and it's absolutely an aspect. You can't remove that. Um, in a lot of cases, tactical assessments nowadays include the morale of the enemy, the morale of the opponent and the adversary. And so, understanding that aspect and understanding what can tilt another player, within again us this being someone having a good time and not trying to like infuriate them or aggravate them, right?
Yeah.
um but it's still something, it still happens without
Mhm.
having to infuriate or aggravate them. And
Mhm.
so that's one thing. To the tactical aspect, and I think probably more of what you were asking about, there are plenty of cases of, I mean, you take George Washington in the French and Indian War, was the case where he learned essentially the unfortunate aspect of having to fight uphill and what that actually means, and with the advantage of high terrain and low terrain and what that does. And so there's several examples of determining what the best tactical scenario is, and you can relate it back to historical examples. The the trick and the trap therein is to not think that they are exactly comparable, understanding that your circumstances are always going to be their own situation, divested from any other. It is not ever fair to say this is exactly like this, because there's always going to be different context. And so when it comes down to looking at history, I think that I mean, there are so many vignettes, case studies or examples of different tactical scenarios that can be used and applied to how we go about certain things. And it's written, I mean, really the basis and foundation for what we understand of maneuver and the game that we play. There's a reason why you move first and then you shoot and then you go into combat, and the way we understand it and the way it's gone down, because that's exactly how certain things go. I mean, would I love to see the development much like in Apocalypse, where it's we go back and forth, like I activate a unit, you activate a unit. I'd love to see that aspect because there'd be so much more dynamic engagement. But I'm absolutely content and understand where we're at in 40K, and there's a lot of tactical aspects to that that still shine
It's
through.
it's interesting because I've actually heard you say that you would prefer it be called the maneuvering stage instead of the movement stage. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the difference is in that sort of nomenclature?
Sure, absolutely. And so, yeah, I mean, it is something that as a armor officer, right? So I spent time as a scout when I was a lieutenant, and a tank commander as a captain. Um, and it is something that we spend so much time teaching people, teaching professionals even, that there is a point where you transition from movement to maneuver. Movement is driving down a road and just going point A to point B. Maneuver is moving with the intent of achieving a position of advantage in order to engage upon the enemy, which is a huge difference from just moving, right?
Hmm.
Uh, when you get into a tactical scenario, you understand that you have to understand that you are now maneuvering. You are no longer moving. And so when it comes down to it in combat, the whole thing is just about getting into a better position to achieve tactical success. That's absolutely what it is. And when we say, well, we're just going to move here to there, well, it doesn't demonstrate and I know, words mean things and we got to go through that, but it doesn't demonstrate the intent that goes behind it. There is absolutely, when you're playing 40K, by the time you deployment is your first move. It is, you have maneuvered onto the field. And that's where, in a lot of the scope and scale with 40K, I enjoy people's perspectives on what's happening or how it's going down. This, 60-inch by 44-inch table that we have is just a snapshot of the greater battle, or it's the one-off battle, or it's whatever. Uh, but you didn't just show up magically. I mean, some people, yes, they do absolutely magically teleport onto it, but uh, you showed up with intent, which is where I think it's so important, as you mentioned, list building, right? That's almost like the logistics of this whole aspect. And then we go into deployment, and with deployment, and this is why I think it's so important with terrain setup and how terrain is positioned, because you don't just move into random terrain and decide I'm going to fight here. Especially, we consider 40K and all the relative science or whatever they have to conduct analysis on. You chose that place to fight for a reason, to a certain extent, right? Sometimes if you're defending, you would hopefully have chosen that. If you're attacking, there's a reason why you chose that area. And even if it's a meeting engagement, there's a reason why you moved into that area. And so that's where I think it's so important, allowing some players to have some agency in terrain setup, which is why I like the current frontline gaming setup of where you set up your half of the table, I set up my half, almost as if there's a reason why we chose how to set that up. Because by the time we deploy, especially in 40K, in most cases, you've already seen each other. Like that's it. There's so much nowadays, and what we see, whether it's current events or what have you. I don't necessarily have to see you. I can have a little drone thing see you or something like that. And so that the game doesn't account for that, which is why I think that there's so much to it about it being a tactical aspect, because it is so focused into it. And so maneuvering and understanding that difference, and I think it's important for wargamers too. Don't just move your things willy-nilly. You're maneuvering, do it with intent. What is the purpose for why I'm going into this? Chess has this aspect of, essentially, for amateur players as they're developing and learning how to play, how many moves did you waste getting into the game? And it's absolutely applicable to 40K as well. Were you just moving something to move it, or covering space, or did you really have an intent behind that? And I think that that's something that a lot of players getting into it have to pick up and learn.
Actually, I feel a lot more comfortable at the table ever since, because you mentioned that on Forge one day. You talked about like making sure that you're maneuvering and not moving, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna try it. And I feel like since I've tried doing that, I feel a lot more comfortable in my decision making and a lot more confident at the table. Like no matter what the outcome is, it's like I'm making a plan and I am actively engaged in trying to make that plan happen. And I don't know what it was. When you said that, something clicked in my brain, and I'm so glad that we're actually covering this because it's been super helpful for me as a new wargamer. So thank you for talking a little bit about that and sharing it with the viewers as well. Um, Now, I did say that I am not like a history buff. I'm not like and everybody assumes that I am because I play Imperial Guard, right? They're like, "Ah, you must be like all into like military history." And I'm not. It's not something I'm opposed to looking into, but I'm not really too sure where to start. Like the history of war, like as long as humans have existed, there has been war. So if I want to look at past military engagements in order to maybe analyze them to become a better wargamer, where should I start? Do I just pick a random military engagement and then start to break it down some way? Like, is there any tips that you could give me on how I could use these engagements of the past to learn.
So yes, and that's it's important in this regard because some folks will say, they'll try and bracket off different aspects of time in relation to warfare. And there's ancient warfare versus modern warfare versus classical, so on and so forth. And so some of it, when you go back, is helpful in certain regards. And it's all about what you're looking for and what you can find that will apply and will effectively break into what you're trying to do. And so in some cases, clearly artillery as we know it did not exist up to a certain point, right? Combined arms maneuver only existed up to a certain point. The Romans had siege warfare down. They had marching effects down and how to get large aspects up there. Uh, and they wrote and they put all sorts of things into history and records that you can go back and look at. And I think that there's some great aspects to how they go about those things to look at, whether it's the Romans or even how the recordings of some of Alexander's fights. And what you see in a lot of those cases that you'll be able to bring out is that a disciplined structure and an understanding of the lay of the land. They didn't have someone else making maps for them. They didn't, as in like they didn't have GeoInt, they didn't have satellites and all that. They had to understand truly the terrain. They had to maneuver cohorts of units and elements to be effective. But they didn't have a lot of these other aspects, right? And so there's some simplicity to it that you can see. Okay, well, this block did this to this, and it's almost like you could take that and directly port that into what was old school Warhammer fantasy battles, right? Because there's so much of line and rank that applied well to that. When it comes to 40K, though, there's a lot of guerrilla aspects. There's a lot of combined arms, clearly, I mean, between flyers and indirect artillery and those kinds of things. And so, I can say it's cool to hail back to ancient Rome and ancient warfare, but you really start looking at some examples of I mean, you could cut right to it and look at Napoleon in some aspects. I mean, Napoleon was an artillery officer first and foremost when he began. And so he understood. And when I say artillery officer, and I know this is going to hurt some of my peers' feelings, but cannons were direct fire weapons. They did not shoot over hills like they do now, which is more in vein with he wasn't cavalry, right? Because he wasn't necessarily horse mounted, but like that is more in line with the modern day tank systems than it is with artillery as people know it now today. And so massing those kinds of effects, right? He was efficient at doing that and how he brought about forces and how he organized them, which is a whole other thing that I could get into with 40K. But for your examples you're talking about, looking at uh, some of the military examples more specifically, if there's a lot of good successes to look at in Napoleon's earlier deal, and clearly there's a lot of good things to learn from his failures later on, right?
Hmm.
Um, and there's a whole reason to how those things came about. I mean, great debates on why some of those failures came about that I think some players could apply to their approaches in game as well. So Napoleon's a great one. The Civil War, the American Civil War, it's there's so what's cool about the Civil War and what applies in what we're talking about here is that the United States, in comparison to the Confederate traders, they the United States, those two very tactical engagements. A lot of people unfortunately died in those conflicts, but very tactical lineups that, for example, if you go to West Point, you can go to West Point's public site without any necessary like access or anything, and you can actually see maps of how it shows their blocks and how they maneuvered on each other and how they use terrain, and they have breakdowns of certain aspects of the fights. You can look at staff rides that show the terrain, so on and so forth. What's really interesting to see though is some of the memoirs of the officers and how they planned things out and what they thought was happening and what they thought was going to go down. um, compared to what actually happened later, for example. And so there's some good stuff to pull out of that. Again, tactical aspects. It doesn't help as much with the uh, the unit by unit case that we have for 40K, but there's plenty to learn about how things flanked and how people have used elements to create certain effects on the battlefield. I mean, it was Napoleon who talks about finding the point of penetration and literally throwing everything you have at it, right? And so for guard players, we understand having broad fronts with tons of infantry, but we understand where we have what you want to do in this case, because we have, so like taking my list for example with my 2 mana cores and my wyvern and my little core of heavy bolter teams, is I want to protect that and I want to make it look dispersed enough that I'm not showing the enemy or my opponent where my point of penetration is. That if they just hit this side of my flank right, my whole thing will crumple as they get into the vulnerable aspects of what I have, right? And so some of those elements I think do really well to learn from that. Now as we get into more modern aspects, um, there's some good things to take away from World War One, World War Two. World War One's great case studies and what we find ourselves often set up against because there's no. It's hard in some cases, especially having the same type of army. It's hard to really envelop, as in like go all the way around and penetrate to the sides of the army. Right? World War One cases, it's two armies literally facing each other, fighting across no man's land, and so that's the development of the tank. As cool as we talk about it now with main guns and everything that it's supposed to do, the development of the tank was to get it across no man's land. That's why it exists. The Rhino in 40K does just that, right?
Hmm.
And so understanding why things exist and what their purpose is and what they're going into it, history can provide some really good examples as to why we do those things and why we have those aspects. So that's given a few examples. You could probably go further into, um, if talking about in the last 50 years, there's several conflicts. Anti-air is a real thing, right?
Hmm.
It's the reason why people, we hear terms thrown about nowadays about air superiority. The development of anti-air is getting to the point that air superiority no longer exists.
Hmm.
And in 40K, um, it's interesting in the regards of how durable some flyers are with relation to presently just how effective anti-air systems can be,
Hmm.
because I mean one missile takes most things out of the sky in modern day terms. So I'm not sure exactly what drastically changed in the next 40,000 years that planes are able to endure so much,
But not
but
flamers.
right, yeah, not flames, right,
uh,
so
so
yeah.
ridiculous. Okay, so I go ahead and I pick an engagement. Whatever engagement I'm going to pick to study. What is the first thing that I look at in order to pull information out of it?
So I think it's important to have a scene setting in any historical example. Understand the context because we go back to why you can't compare your current circumstances to theirs as a carbon copy, because their context sets you apart from your context. And so just it doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to be a huge read or anything like that, but just some context and understanding what you're fighting, right? A very interesting conflict we've looked at is the Boer War, the British Empire versus the Boers in Africa. And so that's where, I mean, the British Empire threw a lot of what it had at technically a group of farmers, and the farmers didn't do too badly. And so understanding the context of what those farmers had versus what the British Empire had in those cases was very important because, I mean, in most cases, you just think, well, they're just farmers, and the British Empire at that time was perceived to rule the better part of the planet, right? And so why did they have so much trouble with it? Why did they struggle? Well, you look at it and the farmers, these Boers, knew their land. They knew exactly how they were going to fight it. They knew what they were going to do with it. And so you go into a whole case deal with 40K of how you're going into terrain and what the terrain looks like and how you're going to use that to your advantage. You take, for example, LVO, you understand what tables you are going into. You could, in some cases, if you have the terrain available, or even if you go on Tabletop Simulator or what have you, you could lay out the terrain and go through examples of how you're going to fight the terrain. The Boers, in this case, historically, didn't have to do that as much because they lived on it.
Hmm.
And so, understanding that context of the terrain when you play against someone, is this someone that knows their terrain like they lived on it? Is this all they've been doing? Am I the new person in in this example that has to learn the terrain to figure it out? And so there's some of that. So that's context. The next part is understanding what they have capability wise. What were they looking at numbers wise? Like when I mentioned Caesar versus Pompey, they the numbers were a whole thing, right? And so you should be able to look at the numbers and say, well, these relative in its most simplistic fashion, the ratios, 6,000 to 2,000 in the very generic example I use, that's 3 to 1. I should have that. I should have a 3 to 1 ratio. I should be able to attack that and win. Then you go back and start to peel back the onion on how, because you already know the end result, right? You
Hmm.
already know that. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind as you start to essentially reconstitute the entire historical event. You know what happened at the end result. You know so and so won. And so now it's like it's like one of those movies that shows the very ending at the beginning of the movie, and then you get to watch the whole movie going forward, right? So
Hmm.
I think that's very important aspect of how you put it together, reconstruct the event, and develop the understanding of why that ended in that way. um, I was talking about theory and doctrine, right, in relation to history. And I know someone out there, some military theorist, is going to come after me for this. But when I mentioned Clausewitz, and as one of the greater writers on military strategy and theory and tactics, that in his theory, he often talks about not focusing on the winner, but more about the loser in a lot of cases, because the loser clearly did something wrong in light of what the winner was doing. You're going to learn more from looking at the failures than you are at the winning aspect of it. Jomini, Clausewitz's reported rival in military theory, who Jomini was for Napoleon, Clausewitz was not for Napoleon. Jomini said all of his, well, not all, but many of his lessons, significant number, were pulled from the victories of Napoleon. Do these things and you will win, right? I think that there's a lot of value to Clausewitz's approach in regards of looking at failures and understanding what failed along the way, because those are the actions that you want to avoid more so than the things that you're going to do well, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Your failures are more often than not going to bring you down.
Yes, I think that that also seems more applicable as well if you're looking at cases where if you just looked at how many boots on the ground these forces had and one had quite an advantage but still lost, it seems as though in that situation in particular you would get a lot more information out of why they lost. That's going to be a much more valuable lesson to learn because the like essentially the deck was stacked for them to win and they still lost. So that was a huge mistake that they would have made in that instance.
Right. Exactly. And so, that's the Schlieffen plan that the Germans had going into World War I. They had all these great numbers figured out. They were going to go in there. They needed something along the lines of like 74 regiments in order to execute this effectively. And the whole purpose being that they can hit France so quickly and take it out of the fight before they inevitably have to fight Russia, right? Well, when they go into it, they have less than 50 regiments and they're spread out inappropriately. And they go in and they just didn't, they still executed the plan with a fraction of what they had determined they needed. And it doesn't work out and it leads into World War I because didn't have the power to fight through. And then they didn't have the power to fend off the Russians. And so there's so much to learn from executing something in failure and pulling that out and understanding why versus in a lot of cases, I mean, you take Desert Storm and the victory that the Americans achieved in that case is to a degree an anomaly. And I'm not trying to downplay what occurred because there was a lot that went into it and a lot of effort. And there was also 5 months of operational strategic effects inflicted upon upon the adversary. But as America went in and the speed at which they executed it, their assessment was significantly higher in regards of casualties, significantly higher. And they did not they hit it so quickly and so fast and achieved almost catastrophic success, whereas the 500,000 strong Iraqi Republican Guard essentially just rolled over in a lot of cases. And don't get me wrong, again, 5 months of strategic bombing will set you up for that. But as the American Army rolled in Desert Storm, there's so many things to just say, well, they did that, but really the adversary, the Republican Guard in this case, largely rolled over. Why did they roll over? What was established in such a way that they did that? It was far more, there's far more to look at to what they did wrong than it was to say the Americans came in and did this.
Hmm.
It's there's a lot of tactics in all of that that went down because it was such a large operational campaign. But at the same time, we can see where the Republican Guard was laid out. We can see what their supply lines were. We can see all of those things, and we can see where it failed successively over time in some
Hmm.
cases.
Hmm. Okay, I have one more question, and I think it's a fun one.
Cool.
So, you are a Black Library fan. I don't know if I know anybody who has read more Black Library novels than you, right? So, I am curious because I've read a few, right? And
Okay.
I particularly enjoy ones about the Imperial Guard because I am a fangirl. So, I'm curious, have you read any Black Library novels that write about tactical engagements well?
Mm. I
Ooh, I
mean,
gave
the
you a
answer is
doozy.
well. I'm starting to pull them all together, right?
Okay.
So the answer is yes. I think that many of them write tactical situations well. It's some cases, and I had a pretty good discussion with Paul and Dan Abnett on
Mhm.
this to a certain point, right? Which I mean, still blown away by those two conversations with Dan. But as we go through the Black Library, and I mean, we're talking warfare is the theme, right? It's the theme. That's it. Um, I have found the more that, and I can imagine as a writer, and that's why I'm trying to put myself in the shoes for some of these cases. As things become more, when I say solid, I mean cohesive, as in focused. In a lot of the vehicle based conflicts, I feel they get very much more tactically minded because the writers are trying to convey positioning. They're trying to convey how the vehicles are set up and arranged and those kinds of things. When it comes to infantry, because there's in so many cases so many of them, a lot of cases it becomes difficult to convey just exactly where it's at in the wider range of of the infantry based aspect. And so I feel the more we get with some of the vehicles, the more tactical the writing becomes as compared to the infantry. A lot of times they're just advancing. They're just there. They get there. Um, of course, being a huge Dan Abnett fan and Gaunt's Ghost breaking into small teams in a lot of cases, you do see a lot of these almost like mini kill team readouts, right? Of how their like teams accomplish all these different tactical objectives that link into this greater operation that they're conducting, which essentially is like book by book by book. And it's so good. I mean, it's just so well. I can tell you, have you gotten to any of the Talarn books
No,
in
but it's next in my
Horse Heresy?
reading list, so
Oh
no
man. So
spoilers.
I won't spoil
Okay.
anything, but I can just say, I mean, you know, kind of like we are talking about with history, right? The cool thing about looking at history is you know the ending, you know where it's going to go,
Hmm.
and we know that Talarn is the place where the Iron Warriors met with literally everything the Imperium could bring to like defend it, right? And we know that Talarn ends in essentially a desolate dust world that these extremely hardy people arise from later in 40K. And so with that, um, so you're going to go from that book, and then down the line, there's books that are more focused on Titans, and Titans do. I think there's a lot to it, and some of the tactical aspects, right? Titans are the equivalent of what some people might feel like tanks are nowadays, right? Being able to just drive through everything, reach out and touch things kilometers away, and that kind of stuff, right? And that's where um, some of these things that they do in the Black Library really, really well. I think some of the stuff with the Space Marines, it's kind of interesting because they're so durable that in a lot of cases, Space Marine writing, they almost like it's mundane, like the tactical approach. Like they just do this. They
They're
just
just
show up and they do it.
perfect. They
Right.
just
Yeah. I mean,
always
they
accomplish
glide
the
through
mission. And yeah.
it. They do.
Interesting
They
though,
glide through it.
have you read Storm of Iron?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you feel about the tactics in Storm of Iron? No spoilers.
So, I mean, it's, and that's where we go back into, and I understand it's not like everybody has gone through, uh, you know, military history or gone through and actually been in a tank or been in and these kinds of things. And so I thought that it portrayed the scenario well. I thought that it did okay with it. I thought that there were just so like it's like the movie Fury, right?
I've not
Have
seen
you
it.
seen the movie Fury?
No.
Okay, you should see that. You
Okay.
should see Fury. Fury is a movie about a single tank crew, more or less, in World War II. um, it's a really great movie, but it's also not that historically accurate in a lot of
Mm.
cases.
Hmm.
And so, whereas I really like Storm of Iron and what it portrays and what it shows through, I think that, I mean, if I remember correctly, Storm of Iron's been around for a hot minute.
Yeah, it's
Unless,
an older
right,
one. Yeah.
right, right. And that's what it's so, I mean, again, and it's not just that the person, I mean, good, great book,
It's great.
but as they have progressed, they've gotten a lot better in being able to depict things. And as I mean, I think that it's something that over time, I mean, you think about, I'm trying to think when Storm of Iron came out, but I'm pretty sure it's long enough that, I mean, really talking generations of readers, and I consider a generation of a reader probably like every 4 to 6 years because of how the books come out, right? There are
Hmm.
people who got into this hobby as um, the Siege of Terra is going down in Horus Heresy compared to someone who when Storm of Iron came out, and it's so drastically different in how the Black Library has advanced lore and scene setting and everything like that. And
Hmm.
so Storm of Iron's great, and I think it's a good thing to call back to. But I'd probably lean more into some of the newer stuff that they're delivering if you wanted to go for more some tactical accuracy and refinement,
Okay.
if that makes sense. If
I'm
that makes
not
sense.
I'm not going to skip ahead because there are spoilers. So, but I will get there eventually. I know you and you and Paul want to talk about it so bad on the podcast, and I'm just like, no, I can't. I can't hear it.
No, no, it's okay. I appreciate your journey. The to be able to go back and read those for this first time is desirable. I wish I could because they're
Yeah.
just that good.
Yeah. Well, I think that this has been a really great conversation. I've learned a lot. I am going to try my hand at picking an engagement and breaking it down and seeing what I can learn from it. And yeah, was there anything that you wanted to add before we sign off?
And since we talk often, I'll try and think up a good example if I can and point you in that direction. I'll try and pinpoint something a little more clearly than my vague meanderings. But the there's some great ones out there. I just got to think about it. What's really worth your time? So, um, but yeah, I'll think into that. And then no, I really appreciate this opportunity. I hope everybody enjoyed my vague meanderings.
Awesome. So if people want to hear more from you, Red, where can they find you?
So of course, weekly alongside you on Forge the Narrative, and then I'm also for the U.S. Army Esports team. There's Black and Gold Wargaming, which is our community page that we foster. So anyone that wants to reach out to us there is more than welcome to. There's also the Worthiest Adversary. It's sort of a passive deal that I've put on the side right now as I've been doing the 40K team aspect, but it's out there too, and I'm always willing to engage and talk to folks about generally anything wargaming. So
Awesome.
thank you.
Thanks so much, Red. And I think we might try to get you on for another one similar, but a little bit different at some point in the
Okay.
future. Yeah.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity. I look forward to the next time.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Take care.
All right, folks, I want to know, what military engagement should I study to get better at tabletop wargaming? Leave your suggestions in the comments down below. And while you're down there, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, hit the bell, because all of that stuff really does help the channel out. If you would like more content, you can check me out on Forge the Narrative podcast. I also do daily updates to Instagram. If you would like to join a community of really supportive individuals, you can do so by joining my Patreon exclusive Discord. The link is down below. And until next time, everybody, make sure to be nice and roll